space race that really defined an entire decade for the nation. The eyes of the world were on Cuba in 1969 as a missile crisis caused pause and potentially threatened the brink of war. In Germany, the economy was booming, and Nuremberg won the German Soccer Cup. In Bavaria, a commission of experts came together and created the Commission for Electronic Computing in English that would later become the Leibniz Supercomputing Center name. This was at a time when computers filled an entire room, when cables were hanging about, and where it basically looked like early lab experiments.
A number of times on our local watches. It's incredible. We just crossed the milestone of computation, the exascale barrier. So there's the first exascale machine on the top 500 list. And while we were 60 years ago celebrating the first man on the moon, I'm not sure, right now it's a little bit more difficult to get there with all the satellites up, thanks to our friend from DLR, of course. And not surprisingly, and as an Austrian, I have no clue about soccer, of course, but Munich has won the national soccer championship 10 years in a row.
It's our great pleasure to welcome you to this special edition of the Next Gen HPC, where we're going to be celebrating 60 years of the computing that has happened, what's behind us, and where we're going to be discussing and celebrating what's going to be happening in front of us. My name is Laura Schultz. I'm Head of Strategic Development and Partnerships here at LRZ. I am also the Acting Department Head for Quantum Computing and Technologies, and I am joined today by my co-host, Professor Dr. Dieter Kranzemüller, who is the Chairman of the Board of Directors for LRZ, and also an LMU Professor of Computer Science. So today, I'd like to introduce our panelists. We've got a really great lineup of professionals that come from different perspectives, different technology spaces, bringing them together to really talk about the future of HPC and to celebrate what we've already accomplished. So I'm very pleased to have with me Dr. Sabine Donauer. She is the Senior Manager Senior Manager for AI Policy and Communication at Infineon Technologies. And before that, and kind of with that in the same time, she is Senior Policy Officer at the Bavarian Ministry for Digitalization. Joining her on our beautiful 60s couches that we found somewhere at the Bavarian Academy of Sciences is Professor Peter Coveney. Peter is a professor of computer science at the University College of London. He's a professor of applied high-performance computing at the University of Amsterdam. He's a professor adjunct at Yale University School of Medicine, and he's a director of the Center for Computational Sciences at the University of College London. So his business card is rather full. Also joining him is Dr. Jan Goetz. He is the CEO and co-founder of IQM Quantum Computers. So if you haven't heard about IQM, not really sure where you've been. If you're in this space, this is a Finnish-German startup company that really exemplifies, I think, every operational definition of a startup unicorn, has been meteoric success in the last several years, and is really the darling of a lot of European technology circles that we have. And then joining us remotely, I believe, do we have them? Yes, we have, I hope. Can you give me a thumbs up if we have them? Sean Smith. Yes, there we go. Hi, Sean. I can now see you. Sean Smith is Professor of Computational Nanoscience and Technology at the Austrian National Centre in Canberra, Australia. And he's also the Director of the National Computational Infrastructure NCI hosted at ANU. And I think that it is insanely early or late, depending on how you perceive that over in Australia. So thank you so much, Sean, for joining us. And then with him digitally, we have Bob Sorensen, who is the Senior VP of Research for Hyperion Research for High Performance Computing. And I believe he's coming to us from the East Coast of the US. So thank you both very much for joining us today.
Okay,
Happy to be here.
Let's start with a couple of questions. Bob, glad to have you. Despite the time difference. Now, one thing I wanted to know about, with all this quantum hype, what's the truth? What's behind this? Where do we really stand in terms of quantum computing worldwide. Could you give us some insights?
Yeah, sure, definitely. And first off, I'm not going to tell you what I was doing in 1960. So that's off the board right now. But I do want to thank Laura for inviting me to attend this fascinating panel today. I just can't wait to hear the insights that come out of it. Well, functionally, Hyperion Research, we are an HPC. Our pedigree is an HPC, and so we essentially come to quantum computing not as a separate technology, but more in the sense that it is yet another potential advanced computing tool in the toolkit to attack some interesting performance problems. So in some sense, we look at it as if we would look at FPGAs, high bandwidth memory, or what's going on perhaps even in neurocomputing or any other kind of advanced computing technology. So what I just want to do right now is kind of give you a quick sense of what we're looking at from the quantum computing sector writ large to really set the stage. Functionally, the quantum computing sector, as you mentioned, what's going on right now? By the way, I'm going to take my headset off because I'm getting horrible feedback at this point. So what I'm hearing within the sector is we did a market survey that we do every year now, and we released.
I think we're losing you on the microphone. Maybe.
Until the United States every year, and we survey a whole bunch of quantum computing suppliers around the world.
No, that doesn't help.
To gain some traction, finding out what's going on in Europe. And the issue here is that the sector is growing. We projected the market to be about $400 million last year, with a relatively good growth rate of about 22%. We looked at a number of different use cases where the sector is doing really well. We saw things like machine learning, optimization, modeling, and simulation. Monte Carlo process has now become much more of an interesting topic right now in quantum, simply because of its ability to generate really provable random numbers, which is kind of the sine qua non of what you need if you're going to do kind of Monte Carlo processing and cybersecurity stuff. So what's happening is we're starting to see the sector transition from a sense of pure science. How can we implement quantum computing phenomena to what are some of the more interesting and compelling end uses within the sector as well? So people are starting to think, how do I take my quantum computing system and start to integrate it into an overall enterprise or high performance HPC workload capability? And what we're seeing at this point right now is a real sense of interest within the end user community, both within the HPC world and within the enterprise IT world, to start to figure out exactly what does quantum computing bring to the table here for me. And this is, in some sense, a cautionary tale, in some sense, for some of the quantum computing makers out there right now. The bottom line here is that because the technology is still relatively new and evolving, and let me give you an interesting data point. Right now, I'm trying to keep track of the individual organizations, quantum computing suppliers out there right now, who are actually offering some form of quantum computing hardware, either offering it currently on the market or thinking about it or in the research phase. And right now, I'm tracking 44 different organizations around the world. And what's interesting is that statement about it being around the world is fundamentally true. We're seeing developments of quantum computing hardware capability on literally a global perspective. And what I'd like to point out is, unlike the classical IT world, there is no legacy benefit from having a leadership position in classical IT that translates directly into the quantum computing realm. So what we're seeing are a number of quantum computing aspirant nations and companies within those nations who have taken a fascinating leadership role. And I would point out, IQM coming out of Finland. We've seen some great work coming out of Canada, some great work coming out of the UK, even Israel and Japan. Organizations that may not have had a global leadership position in classical IT, but have really grasped the potential of quantum computing. As I said, 44 different hardware makers out there. Interestingly enough, there's about 12 different quantum computing modalities out there right now, and that's at its highest level of abstraction. So we still haven't really figured out exactly how the sector is going to pan out in terms of which modality wins, which modality loses, or ultimately how different modalities being the different ways that you can implement the quantum phenomena to do quantum computing. And it spans things from microkelvin superconducting qubits to room temperature neutral atoms, all the way out to quantum phenomena implemented in true photons. So there's a lot of interesting work going on that right now. The sector has really started to mature and coalesce in some ways that I think are beneficial to not only the sector itself, but to the potential end users. As I mentioned, hundreds of different software companies out there right now. And if there was one major theme of those software companies, it would be hardware agnostic. So those 44 different companies, those 12 different modalities, an end user and a software developer for those particular quantum computing systems, they don't have to pick exactly which particular kind of hardware they use. They can start to write software. The software stack has matured to the point where you can actually participate in writing quantum software and all of the development tools and middleware required to implement a quantum algorithm in a way that doesn't require a deep commitment to a single hardware vendor or even quantum modality, which is really a good thing because it just means that choice and flexibility is still a critical element in what's going on in the sector. One of the interesting things, of course, is quantum computing made its early arrival and garnered a significant amount of interest early on because of its potential for Shor's algorithm and the ability to really break the current state of encryption algorithms that form the fundamental secure communications capabilities that existed throughout the entire classical IT world. Well, that interest, of course, really caught the attention of primarily of governments who were concerned about some of the national security implications of that. Well, happily and I think appropriately, the sector has moved beyond Shor's algorithm and has really started to mature into a wide range of other more interesting applications. And what we've started to see is government programs really understand that quantum computing is an important technology. It's not just about encryption. It's more about energizing advanced computing with a technology that promises significant performance gains for some really critical applications, those ones I mentioned earlier, machine learning optimization and such. So what we're seeing right now is a huge influx of government funding from many nations around the world, trying to encourage quantum computing development. And the thing I like to point out in some respects is not all government programs are alike. And to me, let me just give you my perspective on the big three. The first one is if we look at what China's up to. China is very interested in looking at quantum computing functionally as a national security agenda capability. There's a lot of interesting and compelling research going on within the Chinese quantum computing base, but it is really targeted towards national security agenda. If you look at what's going on in the U.S. from the federal government program, there is much more interest in encouraging a commercial quantum computing sector. The idea of funding research, of government partnerships, and development of technology that ultimately flows to the U.S. quantum computing sector, and that is really the emphasis of what's going on in the U.S. Now, I look at the EU somewhat enviously in some of their government programs, which I feel has a much more sophisticated approach in terms of not only funding a quantum computing community to develop the technology, but to bring the end users in, to make sure that quantum computing has an end use going forward. And I see much more sophisticated programs that bring in commercial organizations. So when quantum computing technology begins to really demonstrate its true performance potential, the end uses will already be laid in place. And I think that's a really interesting way to look at the problem.
I'll put my headphones back on now.
It's much better with your headset. It's much better with your headset. So just to summarize in one sentence, what you've been saying is basically the race is on for quantum computing, but we are still closer to the starting line than to the finish line, and there's many things to do on the way to get there. But there's one point is for sure, it's not the big old companies that we have on the planet, but there's also the chance for somebody brand new to emerge, and I'm sure that Jan is smiling when I'm saying this, no?
Well, but we did a study of the basic composition of the quantum computing supplier base from a global perspective, and what we found that about half the companies that are out there right now that we can track, and we looked at about 112 the last time we checked, 50% of them had less than $500,000, which, by the way, is now equal to the euro, so I don't have to do any translations. It's 1-to-1, I think, of this week. Half the companies that are involved in quantum computing right now have less than $50,000 of annual revenue in 2021, and of those, half of those had no revenue last year. There's a small number of larger quantum computing suppliers out there, but ultimately this is still not a self-sustaining sector. We mentioned the importance of government funding to keep some of these programs going. Also, the idea of corporate venturing, the idea of large companies, and a company like, say, Intel or IBM would jump to mind immediately. The organizations or Quantinuum, which came out of Honeywell. The idea that those organizations receive funding from larger portions of their corporations, but also venture capital funding is a big deal. We're projecting that about $3 billion worth of funding will be injected into the quantum computing sector this year from the VC community alone. That's a double-edged sword right now.
Yeah, Bob, just to interrupt here, because we have somebody with deep insight and knowledge into what the ministries are doing. So Sabine used to work for the Bavarian Ministry on Digital Affairs, and in comparison, that's what the US government did during the space race. So your role is, again, to push this forward, and maybe you could give us some more insights on that.
Yeah, I'm happy to do so. So the Bavarian government continuously, I would say, reinvents itself how to keep our high-tech state vibrant. And we did so again in 2018 when we analyzed and benchmarked where do we stand in Bavaria compared to top-notch ecosystems worldwide in terms of investment, education, and also R&D excellence. So out of that came the Bavarian high-tech agenda that was started 2019. For a small state like Bavaria, that's really an impressive investment sum. There were 3.5 million euros invested into future technologies, into many of them. So for example, 100 new AI professorships, but among this sum also 300 million euros into quantum technologies. And the money will be spent in the next years, for example, in a new quantum computing center where, for example, startups, small and medium-sized enterprises have easy access to try out their ideas, not to have a vendor lock-in, but to have a broad overview of what's possible. But also it will be spent, of course, in professorships, but also into new curricula, because like Bob just mentioned, it's not enough to have the perfect research capacities, but we also need young talents that bring the engineering into it to really bring full stack, full applicable solutions into the commercialization space. So we need way more added to quantum physics, way more engineering capacities, for example, microelectronics design, but also circuit design and testing. And for that, we have new curricula, but also a strong collaboration with the old companies that you just mentioned, for example, Infineon, but also others here in Bavaria, to really provide the use cases, but also help young talents to really understand what's commercially viable in this field. And we think by all of these measures, we will contribute to the next round of prosperity. We are deeply convinced that the next kind of prosperity that we will gain in Europe will be driven by quantum technologies and AI, also combined. That's a very interesting field, what happens when you combine the two technologies. And second, I think it's also viable to the security for our citizens, since we see that cybersecurity is an increasing issue, and I strongly go with the vision of the European Union that we will have a quantum web of secured encrypted communication in maybe 20 years, connecting European capitals, and to really use that quantum web, for example, for our government communication, for military communication, but also, for example, for transmitting sensitive medical or financial data. And in Bavaria, we are creating testbeds for that, to have that secure quantum encryption, also, for example, from Munich to Berlin, but also from Munich to Vienna, to really be part of that safety critical infrastructure in the future. And I think by all of these measures, we really contribute to European digital sovereignty, which has been even more important in the last days, I think.
And I think that's, I'm sorry, can you hear me? So I think that's a really important term and a really excellent segue into Jan, is the idea of European technological sovereignty. So Jan is the CEO of IQM. So Jan, what does it take to develop quantum technology? What's the bridges? What are the challenges? How does this process work?
Yeah, so with IQM, we build quantum computers, and you mentioned that in the early days, the computer filled a complete room and there were cables hanging around. So I think that's a good analogy. If you have seen these systems, they still look very similar, I guess, to what was there. And what we do as a company is we take this and we build products out of it that can be commercialized. And we know we are at the beginning and it's a long road. But of course, we still see there's a lot of value actually also starting now in the early days. So a quantum computer in the end is nothing else than a classical computer. So it's a machine where you bring a problem in, you program a problem in, and you get an answer back. And of course, the big promise is that the quantum computer can solve certain tasks much, much faster than classical computers. But in the end, what we need is a machine that does this task. And there are still different technologies out there to build such a system. With IQM, we are building so-called superconducting quantum computers. So the chips, the actual processors, they are cooled down to low temperatures where they become superconducting. But in the end, it's a silicon chip with structures on it as well. So what we do is we design those chips. There we have quite powerful software tools to design them, simulate them, and then we do the tape out. So we produce the complete chips on 200 millimeter wafers, silicon wafers, and then we cut them into smaller pieces, package them, and build a complete computer around it. And of course, this sounds quite simple, like this, but there are lots of challenges. And the main challenge is that for these computers to really work in an efficient way, the processors need to grow. And also another challenge is that because of the quantum nature, there are inherent errors. So the operations are never perfect. And this creates some kind of challenge in order to really run certain algorithms that create an advantage. So where we are at the moment is, and this is still, in my opinion, very important, we can build systems that work, so you can run certain algorithms on them, and this means you can educate people, and we have touched this already. There's a huge shortage, and we get to know the technology, and we get to know how this can be used. And I think also the fact that we are here today in a supercomputing center shows that it's not only the quantum computer. So a quantum processor has also some drawbacks. One, for example, is we don't have a quantum memory yet. Maybe there will be one in the future, and also we are not able to get huge amount of data into the processor. So they are good in solving very complex problems, but the problem size cannot be very big. And I think this is one of the reasons why, in the end, we always need a hybrid system where we have a quantum computer which works hand in hand with a classical, more powerful computer, and the classical computer can outsource certain tasks to the quantum machine and then gets the answer back. And in this kind of ping-pong game between the classical and the quantum computer, they work together. So this is in the end what we do. So we build systems, and the first one is now being installed here. And I'm actually very excited to see then how this story develops, so that we, in a very close partnership, can develop this hybrid approach to quantum computing together.
And as the department head for quantum computing, I can only say that I strongly agree with you. Rolling on that concept, the idea of taking these technologies, hardening them, bringing them into an environment with the HPC systems, coupling them together, making this work together to integrate together, I'd like to go to Sean as director of another compute center, fairly similar to ours at LRZ. Sean, what role does quantum computing, quantum acceleration play within your compute center now? How do you see this as an advantage to your users, to their applications? What is your priority and your interest in this?
Thanks, Laura. Can I just double check you can hear me okay?
You can.
Oh, that's great. Okay. So indeed, NCI Australia is hosted at the Australian National University in Canberra, and there are many similarities between the mode of operation of NCI and LRZ in Munich. So our activity in the context of quantum computing within the Australian sector has largely been in the context of providing capacity for quantum algorithm simulation for scientists who are working in this domain and building up understanding and capacity for quantum computing algorithms. We do have two national tier 1 supercomputing facilities here in Australia, NCI in Canberra and the Pawsey Supercomputing Centre in Perth out west. And interestingly, in Australia, we've really seen actually the innovation of individual research operations spinning out into commercial startup companies in supercomputing, which has in many ways led the federal investment into supporting quantum computing. And so there are a number of standout startup companies in our sector who engage with our centres at NCI and at Pawsey, as well as international ones. So there are startups working on silicon-based quantum computing platforms, which come out of, for example, UNSW in Sydney. Professor Michelle Simmons and Professor Andrew Dirac both have startups which are spun out of UNSW and are really active in this space and have made a lot of yards. Here at ANU, we have a startup in doped diamond systems, which in principle can operate at room temperature, headed by Dr. Marcus Doherty and colleagues, who I understand have operations both here in Australia and across in Germany. And they are launching a demo facility across at the Pawsey Supercomputing Centre in Perth. So there have been really interesting innovations, and this was alluded to by our colleagues, that the quantum computing space is really a green field for innovative startup operations. And that's also been the case here in Australia. We are now seeing federal investment starting to spin up into the space in order to support the development of quantum computing startup industries in Australia. And both NCI and the Pawsey facilities are actively involved in the dialogues which are advocating for a growth of federal investment to support this activity. And so currently we're in the middle of a decadal evolution of planning for government investment, and there's a very good chance that there'll be a standing up of federal funding support for continued development of quantum computing here down under. And as I said, it's not just a down under thing. The startup companies are active internationally as well, and I think, for example, Quantum Brilliance, the diamond-based company, are also active in the German ecosystem as well. So it's a very vibrant and rapidly developing sector. We have a very close watching brief on it, and we are looking for opportunities to progressively integrate capabilities into our system as they reach a level of maturity that can support operational developments. It'll undoubtedly be a hybrid mode of activity. There are certain sorts of problems which quantum computing is going to be a winner for, but not all problems, obviously, and so it is going to be a hybrid development amongst other aspects as well. So obviously things like AI and machine learning are other disruptive technologies which are spinning up incredibly rapidly and play important parts complementary to quantum computing as our facilities evolve into the future.
Great. Thank you very much for that. Kind of the ongoing idea, just how much technology is in progress right now being developed, and then the application of that technology over different types of use cases and different workflows is going to be a really interesting topic as we continue the evolution of this technology. Now, in 1962, in September, President Kennedy gave the famous moonshot speech. And he said that within this decade, we are going to put a man on the moon. We do this not because it is easy, but because it is hard. And within 8 years of that speech, to the end of 1969, we went from John Glenn orbiting the Earth 3 times in the Friendship 7 to putting footprints on the moon. That was in 8 years. Now, Peter, you are a premier researcher for biological systems, which seem to have a certain affinity to quantum computing and quantum methods. What potentials do you see for quantum computing in your work? Where could you see potential results within this decade time span and idea when there is an aggressive increase in technology development and improvement as we go along in this application usage?
You introduced me, and one of my roles is the director of the Centre for Computational Science at UCL, and the catchphrase for that is advancing science through computers. So that means we'll look at any form of novel computing methodology and try and implement it as long as it delivers something that advances science. Quantum computing has that potential, and therefore it's coming under severe and rigorous investigation by us in a way which I think is very important for everyone to understand. What is the possibility of doing quantum computing today on systems that are interesting to me, and the ones you're effectively asking us about revolves around the usability of these systems. So most of the work that I'm involved in with quantum computing is a bit different from that of many of my colleagues who are in a large, you could call it a bubble, that's research for quantum computing for experts in quantum computing. You understand my interest is in getting the technology to deliver for people who aren't interested in quantum computing per se, but in the results that it produces. So again, something I was talking about earlier is the importance of getting your results in a very timely way, being able to predict things that are actionable, and then people can take decisions on them. So at this moment, one of the great so-called killer applications is solving electronic structure problems in the molecular sphere. That's quite simple in the sense that we'll take a molecule and for the first time, the promise of getting, let's say, an exact description of the ground state in a hurry. The last 40 years, as I've looked at that area, virtually no significant progress. I know the experts would disagree, but it's incremental stuff in terms of tens of atoms in molecules where you've still got a chance of doing something which is pretty highly accurate. That's not good enough. And so quantum computing holds out the possibility that we can take molecules of much larger size, potentially arbitrarily, and solve the problems sort of in linear time rather than some very either impossibly factorial or exponentially long time or very high power of the number of electrons in the problem or spin orbitals. Here, what the question is right now, what can I do with a quantum computer of any respectable credibility that solves a problem that's not tractable by these other methods? That's when you talk about quantum supremacy or quantum advantage. Have we seen any quantum advantage for molecular electronic structure calculations? Not really. Largest one, 12-bit Sycamore Google calculation of a set of 12 hydrogen atoms in a row. No one's interested in that problem. I'm interested in problems where I can solve the molecular structure and people will be able to run away with it and do things that have nothing to do with quantum computers. So the first target here is probably drug discovery, where you have enormous proteins, to be sure, and I'm not trying to solve those. I'm looking at the candidate drugs that will sit in the active site. These have many tens to hundreds of atoms in them and large numbers of electrons that would soon be escalating to thousands, right? So roughly speaking, we're going to need to have machines which have tens, hundreds of qubits in them to be viable. How many exist today? Next to none. What's the stability of them? So I can report to you that as of Monday, and I was telling this to a colleague here today, because I'm grateful to Dieter the opportunities to work together to explore new technologies, is we've got access through a collaboration with CERN and the IBM Quantum Hub, and people will probably realize IBM has this long roadmap with a 127 qubit machine called Washington that's available right now, and by the end of this year it'll be 433, and by the end of next year 1,000 qubits. This is all NISQ, so noisy intermediate scale quantum computing. So the stability of these systems is wretched, and everything we do to try and solve these problems is ironically to reduce the amount of time and as it were, you touch the quantum computer and do the rest of the problem on an existing classical device. So you'll find an electronic structure problem where there's a lot of electron correlation in some localized region. Maybe it's got lots of double bonds, triple bonds, and other things. And you'll put that small part of the calculation on it. So you have to develop an algorithm that is avowedly hybrid and deals with the classical and quantum, and you do the rest of the calculation around it, and only the wave function calculation there. That's what we're trying to do, and we're trying to get to a point quickly where I can tell you in a meeting like this that we've got quantum advantage in some sense. But that's still a slightly distant target. The stability of the machines is shockingly small, right? Microseconds is the length of time you've got before the coherence time has gone. So the advantage of having the quantum state and many other problems that come around those technologies at the moment. So it's severely limited for now, and it's maybe, according to my colleagues in CERN, we might be 5 years away from having a much more stable environment to work with. But the maximum qubit count that we or they know, even though the machine is 127 qubits in size, that can perform something reliably is 20 qubits. So a 127 qubit machine, you can't do a big calculation on it. We're at the moment planning to try something up to 20 qubits. But to be fair, perhaps you can run 6 times 20 qubit calculations. This is a quasi-high throughput calculation, which, if we can achieve it, will start to produce some interesting results. And that's my picture of it at the moment. So the drug discovery problem, where you get a good and accurate representation of the molecule that's going to be a drug, could come out of a quantum computer and be interesting. For the drug discovery, remember, 10 years, $3 billion. To get one drug at the moment, the industry isn't profitable on R&D terms. That's the shocking reality. And every drug that is successful at best works for 50% of the population. We need to be in the post-genomic era, making many of these things that are tailored to individuals or stratified groups of the population. We need to be able to do this digitally, and quantum computing, if it can deliver, would play a big role in that. Do you follow? Mm-hmm.
So,
I do.
So, Peter, you mentioned quantum advantage. Do you know what is quantum disadvantage?
There's plenty of quantum disadvantages. At the moment, I'm just explaining, we have to do everything to minimize the amount of contact we have with the machine and use it carefully where we know it will deliver something.
Okay, I'll give you my definition of quantum disadvantage. Quantum disadvantage is that Jan, as a very successful startup, has to be at several events at the same time at this point in time, I think. So thank you, Jan, for joining us. I think you have to leave for the next event. It was great to have you. Thank you also to Bob and Sean, despite the time difference, for your virtual appearance here. We're doing a little bit of change here. I'm welcoming virtually Andy Hock. He is the Vice President of Product at Cerebras Systems, and I hope we'll soon have him also on the screen. And I'm also welcoming my good friend, Professor Andrew Grimshaw. He's an emeritus professor from the University of Virginia, and he's now also at a startup called Lancium Computing. And I think what we hear from both of them is more or less what's besides quantum and what could help Peter with all his demanding projects and the capabilities that he needs. Laura.
Yeah, and I think just to place a little context here. So the LRZ fundamentally, we are really thinking about our next generation systems, and a compute center like ours, and this has been repeated a few times today. We have a very broad user base using different applications from different domain spaces, different workflows, different experience levels. So our systems have to be able to span that entire breadth of user abilities and needs. At the same time, we're in a very interesting evolutionary phase of advanced computing technology where we have exascale technologies, but even there, an ever-increasing CPU evolution, smart NICs. So we've got really interesting things happening with AI ASICs. We now have quantum computing come in. So it really becomes this question, how do we pull all of this together to make it in a way that the users can use it, that it can truly amplify and accelerate their science and the results that they achieve, the scope, the depth, the complexity. How do we bring all of that together? This is a central question that we genuinely think about in terms of our integration strategy that we have at LRZ. Not just from the AI components, but now we're really thinking very strongly about the quantum acceleration into the HPC ecosystem. So to that point, really moving straight to the technology, I'd like to talk to Andy for a moment. We just acquired a Cerebras CS2 system, these very large-scale wafer engines. The unboxing was just this morning with Minister Blume. Andy, give us a little bit of an overview of the wafer scale engine and the CS2 system, what it's capable and what is just genuinely so unique about it.
Yeah, happy to. First of all, microphone check. Can you all hear me?
We can.
Great. Well, good afternoon, and thank you, Laura and Dieter and LRZ for having me. Also, congratulations to LRZ on the 60th anniversary. I think the historical track record is impressive, and I can't wait to see what the LRZ user community does with systems like ours in the future as we go forward. Following panelists' earlier remarks, I think we see that AI and HPC indeed have extraordinary transformative potential, really, on both basic and applied sciences for domains ranging from biomedical applications like drug design to climate science to industrial problems related to commerce, materials design, and a wide variety of others. The fundamental challenge, however, is that the computing requirements for state-of-the-art AI and HPC applications is growing exponentially. Indeed, faster than traditional computing technologies can really keep up. Our approach to solving large AI problems today has traditionally been to take a large cluster of small general purpose processors and distribute large computing problems over that large cluster of small general purpose processors. And indeed, that's gotten the industry a long way. It's delivered some extraordinary results, but it's fundamentally not the optimal solution for large-scale AI and HPC. As an example, the state-of-the-art AI models today often take weeks or even months of computing time on hundreds or thousands of traditional general-purpose processors like GPUs to converge. And that's just one run to convergence, let alone all of the experimental runs that it took to develop a model that converges. And as a result, the research community sees many experiments and models that are just untried. So we need, as a community, a better solution to large-scale AI and HPC computing. The current approach of distributing models over large clusters limits researchers' ability to innovate and experiment. And so at Cerebras, we are an AI computer systems company. We are building a completely new class of processor and computer system to deliver orders of magnitude more performance and faster time to solution for these large-scale AI and HPC problems. As Laura mentioned, we're very excited to have just delivered a brand new Cerebras CS2 AI computer system to LRZ. We're very anxious to get that up and running and in the hands of more LRZ users. But let me tell you a little bit about what's unique about that system and solution. Our system is built on a traditional silicon microprocessor technology, but a revolutionary chip design. The heart of the system that we delivered today is Cerebras designed wafer scale engine. I actually have one with me here today. The heart of our machine and the system now at LRZ is a chip like this. This is actually a real chip. It is the wafer scale engine from Cerebras. I'm actually having a hard time fitting it all on camera, so I'll just stick it right here in the middle. This is an 8.5 by 8.5 inch unbroken integrated chip with 850,000 fully programmable cores that are built from the ground up to accelerate the sparse linear algebra operations common to both neural network computing for training and inference of deep learning models for artificial intelligence, as well as large-scale HPC problems. Not only that, but we also have 40 gigabytes of all on-chip SRAM, and all of those 850,000 cores are directly connected to each other over the entire wafer on a software configurable network on chip. So just to give you a sense of how that compares to both current and legacy technology, that wafer scale engine is 56 times larger than the largest chip ever built before it. It's got more than 100 times as many cores as the latest generation GPU, more than 1,000 times on-chip memory, and more than 10,000 times the communication and memory bandwidth, all on a single device that's as easy to program as a single desktop machine. And harkening back to 1962 and the integrated circuits of the 60s, our wafer scale engine has 2.6 trillion transistors, which is roughly 1 billion times more transistors than the early integrated circuits of the 1960s. So I don't want to go on too long on the panel, but I want to answer the question also, what does this mean? Right? One of these chips, one of these systems typically delivers the compute performance for artificial intelligence and HPC applications of many tens to hundreds of traditional processors such as GPU. So that means instead of weeks or months for model compute time, we're talking about maybe hours or days, allowing researchers to bring more data to their models or build larger models to deliver more accurate results, or even build completely new types of AI models with new ML methods that were not possible before. Our current customers and user base are using Cerebras CS2 systems to accelerate applications such as drug discovery, fundamental research into diseases such as COVID-19, precision medicine for cancer, finance, and large-scale natural language processing for applications such as time series modeling or translation, or web and social media applications. I think from my standpoint, the thing that's really exciting about the deployment of the Cerebras CS2 and the wafer scale engine to LRZ is its potential to accelerate time to science. That is, allow researchers to iterate more quickly with more ideas and deliver insight sooner at lower cost. So with that, I'll just say thank you again. We're really excited to see the groundbreaking work that LRZ is going to do with the CS2, and I can't wait to visit in person. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Andy. I think, we're very excited to see how the unique architecture that we have, how it's going to perform on the AI models that our community has, how it's going to perform on HPC AI workloads, these surrogate models, and then also what is it applicable for the quote unquote traditional HPC workloads, stopping to think about it as an AI architecture purely and per se. What capabilities would it actually have for our user community? So we are looking forward to working with you and with the user community and seeing what great science is achieved through this. And this brings me to my next point, and Sabina. So I'm going to ask you to take off your digital ministry hat for a moment and put on your Infineon hat. You are a senior policy manager for AI at Infineon. So a company like Infineon is both developing technological capability, and you're also using that technological capability. So from your perspective, how does the rapidly evolving development around AI, around quantum, around all of this ecosystem here, with these specialized architectures, how does that influence Infineon's work, both from the supplier side and from that vendor user side?
So I think I'll start with us as a potential future customer of quantum solutions. So at Infineon, but also here in the Munich ecosystem, companies like BMW, all these companies have a 3-digit number of AI use cases. And I think that a tremendous amount of those AI use cases will lend themselves to quantum computing solutions once they are available. This is why we have created a network with 10 large corporates, among them Boehringer Ingelheim, BASF, Siemens, Volkswagen, to define reference problems that we have in our specific branch and that we want to signal to this upcoming startup innovation ecosystem to really tell them the problems that we need solutions for and that we would be happy to be a first customer for. So for Infineon, for example, this is complex optimization problems like smart supply chains that tie into our highly automated manufacturing. If we would have a quantum solution for that combined with AI, we could be way more efficient. For Volkswagen, for example, it's battery management, for example, and we have heard about the pharmaceutical and medical advances for other companies in that branch. So by that, we hope to give our domain know-how, give our data, give our reference problems to startups like Jans, for example, and then work together to really arrive at an integrated, application-ready, end-to-end solution in the next upcoming years. So that's us as a customer. But of course, Infineon as one of the leading semiconductor manufacturers in the world, we also will be part of the value chain of providing quantum components. So we are looking into 3 different technologies at the moment, doing our research on superconducting, semiconducting, and iron traps qubits, and with different partners, Jan, for example, but also Oxford Ionics, for example, on different technologies. And we want to be a supplier of quantum processing units in the future and be part of that large value chain that is opening up.
Okay, that's fascinating with all the technologies. Peter, you with your scientific grand challenge problems, how does that sound to you? I mean, what's when you hear about these new technologies, what's the path? What's the next step? And what is missing on your wish list? What would you want?
Let's just talk about, first of all, the AI and machine learning. Of course, there's been a huge amount of hype there, and it's interesting to compare the hype factor for that versus quantum computing. But I believe the latter is supported by far more. In other words, machine learning and AI have tangible capabilities already available. So I'm very much in favor of again, the hybrid solution, but that goes back to what I would call physics-based methods talking to machine learning and AI. I mentioned this before because if you do machine learning and AI in vacuo without paying attention to the structural characteristics of the problem you're working on, by just saying I'm a generic AI or machine learning specialist, you could end up going down very deep tunnels and coming out with nothing. You have to have the 2 things balanced. Now, the reason why ML and AI are always waiting around the corner for us is that conventional HPC is expensive and time-consuming, and one would like a short route to the solution. Remember, if you want an actionable prediction, you want the prediction now for tomorrow, rather than having to wait 3 weeks to find out whether the weather tomorrow was good. So anything that can accelerate that is important. And it's the interplay between the high-fidelity nature of physics-based simulations playing off the ability of machine learning to get solutions fast. That's where the thing is going to come to a very nice sweet spot. That can typically mean that the machine learning methods must be trained on such simulation capabilities, and then you can put the 2 things together. So we have large workflows that are already deployed on Summit with our DOE colleagues, where we do drug discovery activities that start with machine learning to do docking, not the actual docking, but machine learned docking to try and get a first pass through the structure of the drugs, then do some hybrid combination of machine learning with a classical MD simulation to get a better fit for the molecule in an active site, and then unleash high-performance computing to do the more refined and accurate calculations. Now, there's a huge load imbalance there, as we keep saying, because the machine learning and AI is, relatively speaking, cheap and cheerful. It'll get you answers quickly, but they may not be that accurate. So you must be able to play them off against each other. And so that's where a load-balanced workflow of great complexity running on a system that has lots of GPUs and CPUs can be very powerful. The other part of this is what you call surrogates, which is another way of doing what I said. Try to train an ML system to learn how the physics-based system behaves in order that you can replace the expensive calculation or a part of it by the machine learning solution that will produce something much faster. And that itself will also accelerate the time to solution. So these areas I see as very important combinations of the 2. And the quantum computing for me is quasi-icing on the cake to try and further accelerate some of those physics-based calculations to make things even faster and more accurate.
So, Andrew, if I listen to what Peter is saying, I mean, that sounds familiar to many things we have been discussing over the last decades, so to say. But there's one challenge that's coming up since recent years, and it's increasing, especially now with all the difficulties on the world market, which is energy. Now, we are 100% renewable energy here, so all that comes in is renewable. But it comes at a price, and the thing I would like you to explain is, while we are talking difficulties in megawatts, I think you are in an entirely different sphere, aren't you?
Yeah. So, I mean, a lot of people think energy is the big problem. And the big problem Well, it is a big problem, particularly for you all here in Europe right now. But right now, we have in wind and solar the least expensive way to produce energy in the world historically. That's also carbon neutral. But there's two really significant problems with wind and solar, and they're pretty obvious. The first one is that the load, the people using the energy and the generation aren't always very close to each other, and you have to have transmission lines, and that leads to a phenomenon called congestion, where essentially you end up turning off these resources and throwing away terawatt hours of power. So that's the first problem. And the second problem is that they're variable. And as much as we might want batteries to solve the problem for us in the next 4 to 6 years, grid scale batteries are not on a short-term time horizon. So, and if you look at places, I'm going to use Texas as an example because that's where we're working right now. So in Texas, they're pouring on the renewables every year. A lot of people don't understand how fast renewables are coming online. In Texas alone, this year they will bring on 7 gigawatts of renewable power. For those of us who remember John Glenn, a gigawatt is a lot of power. That's sort of a canonical nuclear plant in the old days. Now, but this power has these problems, and in particular, most of it is in a place called West Texas. Okay, and in that area, they have 35 gigawatts of renewable power, 5 gigawatts of indigenous electricity use, and only 12 to 15 gigawatts of wires to carry it out. And by the way, adding more wires isn't cheap or easy politically, okay? So what we're doing is we're trying to flip that equation on its side. My entire career in computer science, we've been building data centers where we try to have 4 nines of power with high availability and reliability and all that kind of stuff. And we make the grid, the electrical grid, not the old computing grids that we're all familiar with, the electrical grid conform to what the computers want. What we're doing is flipping the equation, and we're making the computers adapt to the electrical grid. And the way we do that is we basically ramp the load up and down very rapidly to deal with the variability issues, but also when there's scarcity, we can just essentially get out of the market. So the challenge then is to flip it around and have the computers adapt to what power is available right now, and more generally move other industries into these places where we have lots of power, but not a lot of people or load. And so in particular, that's why we pick computing, because as almost everybody here knows, you only need 2 things for computers. You need electricity, lots of it, and you need fiber to get the data in and out. And fortunately, West Texas is lousy with fiber, and I could explain why, but we only have 2 minutes, so I'm not going to go there. So that's what we're doing, is we're building data centers out there. If you need 600 megawatts, I can get it to you. The price is, the energy cost in West Texas right now is an unbelievably low 1 to 2 cents per kilowatt hour, which is considerably cheaper than what you're paying in Europe. But to exploit that, you got to move your load to places where the energy is cheap. And that's what we're trying to do at Lancium, is build data centers that are very low carbon and extremely inexpensive to operate. And yeah.
And of course, there's one other thing that you didn't mention now, which is the disadvantage of West Texas compared to Bavarian Biergarten, as you told me last night, yeah?
So a lot of the counties there have a population density of less than 1 person per square mile. I'm not going to say whether they have good beer or bad beer, but I prefer Bavarian beer.
It is nicer here, sorry. Okay, so we're wrapping up here, and we've touched on this point several times already, so I'm just going to do a rapid fire answer from each of you. And clearly having so many experts on this panel, I mean, we've heard just the diversity and the depth and breadth of thoughts and perspectives, so we really do thank you for that. So kind of a wrap-up question and rapid fire answers from you. We've just finished, we're in the process of finishing, celebrating 60 years of advanced computing resources and services here at LRZ. Our future is very bright. We're steamrolling right ahead. Our eyes are on the future. What do you think the future of computing looks like? Now, I will not ask you to think 60 years in advance, because there's no way 60 years ago we thought we would be where we are today. But let's say a good decade. Where are we going to be? Peter, we start with you.
I'm going to be optimistic that quantum computing will work, and in that time frame, it should have made a major impact. It could be genuinely transformational if we put behind us all these local issues. The other thing that I mentioned earlier, which hasn't had enough attention, is analog computing. The first computers, back in the times of the ancient Greeks, as well as more recently, were analog. And by departing from those, we've ended up spending far more time and energy in heating the atmosphere up. There are solutions there. There are problems which can be solved using analog computing, for which we can't know the solutions using digital technologies. So these things are interesting for the future.
Great, thank you. Sabina?
I'd also pick a decade to look ahead. So I think that we will be using more of our computing capacities, more of our AI know-how, and more of our talent and investment to really not look into selling ads on the internet or social media algorithms, but to invest them into decarbonization and finding solutions for our energy crisis and the climate crisis.
Thank you. Andrew?
Well, first, predicting the future is easy. Getting it right is hard. I think, in 10 years, as a society, we'll have started a transformation to a more electrochemistry-based economy, and that will include computing. I also think, though, building on something Peter said, I think increasingly we will have essentially specialized sub-infrastructures that are really good at particular types of problems, and we will solve those types of problems on the right solution. Either way, we'll end up with large-scale heterogeneous computing systems that still will demand more power. Because one thing I've learned in my career is you give the scientists more computing power, and all they want is more, more, more. And you guys are insatiable, and the chemists in particular are well known in the community as being the locusts of computing.
Do we have Andy still on? Should we also?
Andy, yes, you are still on. Can we ask you that, please? So 10 years out, what are we looking at?
Sure. And all this talk about Bavarian beer gardens makes me really wish that I could be there in person too.
Yeah, me
but
too.
I'd just like to echo my co-panelists' comments. I think, as we look forward at Cerebras, we see a future of heterogeneous computing where best-of-breed accelerators can have portions of large-scale problems mapped to them for both fundamental physics-based problems, traditional HPC, AI, and this growing range of problems at the intersection between HPC and AI. And coming back to your opening remarks from Laura and Dieter, it's maybe a happy coincidence that just recently NASA published some of the first light images from the James Webb Telescope, which was an extraordinary project of international collaboration between NASA, the European Space Agency, and the Canadian Space Agency. I think what we'll be building in the next 10 years is the next generation of scientific observatories in terms of large-scale compute, where we have purpose-built accelerators, general-purpose systems, as well as specialized systems such as quantum, that provide a platform to researchers to go farther and deeper into problems such as biomedical life sciences and climate and energy than we ever have been able to in the future or in the past. So I'm looking forward to being a part of that and having the opportunity to work together with all of you on that.
Thank you, Andy. So that is a good final word, so to say. There is more science to be done. Let's do it. Thank you very much for the last 60 years. I think it was a good journey so far. We're continuing on that path with whatever technology comes along. Thank you to the panelists. It was great to have you here. Thank you to the audience in the room and also remotely. And of course, also thank you, Laura, for organizing this Next Gen. Next year, I would like to have another real Next Gen without any pandemic or something going on. So we'll keep on doing that, yeah?
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. Goodbye.